We'll see, hopefully, we'll see.
I have a dean search committee. I know those, even though I'm.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming, for being here for what will be, I'm sure, an enlightening lecture. Feel free, if you have the urge for a little more pizza, to, get up and get some more during our time together. And it's my privilege to be able to welcome you to this joint lecture series sponsored by CT State Capitol and Christ Church Cathedral, partners across the way. And we are very grateful to our friends at CT State Capitol for providing the money for lunch. So you can give your thanks to CT State Capitol for our lunch today. We've had so far a wonderful lecture series with Drs. Deborah Simmons, who spoke about American protest music, and Dr. Tuesday Cooper, who talked about the combined effect of a number of social constructs, including education, race, and politics in our contemporary age. And today we're going to follow in that tradition. And I am very pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Bilal Sekou. Dr. Sekou is Associate Professor of Political Science in Hilliard College at University of Hartford. He is an expert in American politics and race in politics and public opinion and urban politics. We could keep going on. He is the model of a scholar activist. He is a published scholar as well as a community leader. He has served on the boards of directors of a number of civic organizations, including, how long were you with Common Cause?
That was 14 years.
14 years. He was eventually chair of Common Cause Connecticut. He is currently chairman of the board at Connecticut Mirror and the Open Communities Alliance. And so Dr. Sekou has a bachelor's degree from Eastern Michigan University. He has a MPA, Master's of Public Administration, from The Ohio State University, and a PhD in political science from The Ohio State University. And we're all very privileged that he decided to relocate to Connecticut, where he is a phenomenal teacher and colleague and a sought-after commentator on local media and local events. Today, Dr. Sekou will be talking on the subject, elections have consequences. The radical assault on civil rights. Dr. Sakou.
Thank you, Dr. Aliotta. Let me say what a pleasure it is to be here this afternoon to share just some of my thoughts about the last presidential election and also the effect of that election on our country. And you know, what's interesting about this is that, you know, my first vote that I ever cast, you know, the first time I ever cast a ballot for a vote was in 1984, when I was years old. And I had a chance to vote for the first time. And I thought in many ways, you know, that was an incredibly important election. And it was important because it was my very first time ever casting a vote. And I've actually voted in every presidential election and practically every election that I've had an opportunity to vote in, I have voted. I've been very involved in work here in Connecticut trying to expand the opportunity for people to vote. My work that Professor Aliotta mentioned with Common Cause in Connecticut, I was both on the chair of the state board, but also a member of the National Governing Board, and protecting elections and expanding access and opportunity to voting was something that was really critical to us. And so I take very seriously the importance of voting, the importance of not just voting, but being civically engaged, being you know, aware of what's going on in the world, paying close attention. And so I definitely encourage young people to pay attention because elections have consequences. And I think what we're learning very quickly in what has felt like maybe 8 years, but only 80-some days, is that elections do in fact have consequences, and that it's really important for us to be engaged and involved in our political system. So when I got the invitation to do this, I was sort of thinking about a way to do this that it wouldn't just be me talking at you for the entire time, but to really engage in a conversation with you about what happened to our country during the past presidential election and leading up to that, what has happened since then, and where are we going as we go forward as a nation. So in my presentation, I'll throw out a series of questions that I'll try to provide some answers to, preliminary kinds of answers, but I'm also hoping that those questions can be the basis of a conversation with you based on your reaction to both the question and what it is that I present in putting this forward. So in thinking about the 2024 presidential election and the outcome of that election, you know, a lot of ink has been spilled, a lot of newspaper articles and email posts and posts on social media and, you know, electronic media asking the question, what happened, right? How did Donald Trump return to the White House? And so that first question is about, how did Donald Trump win, right? How did he win? And as I said, there's a lot of ideas out there about what exactly happened, right? A lot of people point to the white working class as being really instrumental in their sort of anger about what the Democratic Party has failed to do in terms of protecting them from globalization. Certainly there are a lot of folks who talk about the anger people feel about a range of different cultural issues, whether it's transgender rights or LGBTQ rights or DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sort of that reaction and angst to those kinds of issues. People have argued perhaps is a reason why this election happened. Certainly immigration played a big part in the reaction that many Americans have to what they perceive as a looming threat of immigration and what it may mean for our country and the effect that it's having on our country in that sense. And there are probably about another 20 or 30 other reasons people have offered for that election, right? And so when I look at a lot of this, I ask myself, you know, well, there's what we believe happened, and then we can ask ourselves, is that really what was going on? Is that really what caused this? And so when I think about this claim that Donald Trump's return was a function of the white working class sort of deciding that they wanted to, go all in and support him to make sure he was returned to office. What's really interesting is that when you actually look at the election outcome and you actually look at, who voted and how they voted, Trump actually did not expand his white working class base as much as people have talked about it. That wasn't why he returned to the White House. In fact, what he did was he mainly mobilized that sort of pre-existing cross-class white base of the Republican Party, a base that has been growing since the 1960s, really, when you think about it, in reaction to, as we will talk later, the rights movements of the 60s, the Black Civil Rights Movement, the Latino movement, the Asian American movement, the anti-war movement, a lot of the cultural changes that have affected our country has really mobilized a lot of people in the Republican Party and under the Republican brand. And as we will talk later, Donald Trump has been incredibly effective in mobilizing that base of people within the party. Another thing that really stood out to me about this election is that actually Kamala Harris gained about 2.7 million more white votes than Biden received in 2020. So the idea that Harris was just this incredibly unpopular person who failed to mobilize the base and to grow her base, in reality, she actually had success in growing the base in the white community. And more whites voted for her than actually voted for Joe Biden. But what was especially damaging during this election is that she lost about 8.9 million votes of people of color that Joe Biden had won. So what happened with this election is that on the one hand, Harris picked up support among whites, but she lost a lot of support among people of color who had shown up in 2020 and voted for Joe Biden. In fact, Trump did gain among people of color. He picked up about 2 million more votes from people of color than he did in 2020. It shouldn't come as a surprise. And I remember, before the election, there was a lot of talk about the way white women would vote in this election. And there were a lot of predictions, especially around the issue of abortion rights, that more white women would actually show up and vote. But here's the thing about the votes of white women in terms of the majority, is that the Republican Party pretty much has had a lock on the votes of white women going back into the 1960s. And so in many ways, while it may have been shocking given the context of what was being debated going into the election and the speculation about how this would, things like abortion rights would damage support for Donald Trump, it actually wasn't surprising that a majority of white women actually voted for Donald Trump, because a majority of white women have voted Republican consistently for a number of years, with the exception of Bill Clinton, who was a Southerner himself, gaining some support. So in that sense, it was no real surprise with the election outcome. What was also interesting, though, when I talked earlier about how so many people of color in terms of dropping out the 8.9 million, and again, Trump picks up about 2 million. But what's interesting is that about 6.9 million people simply did not vote for either Harris or Trump, who were people of color. So a lot of people who look like me didn't show up and vote during that election. Trump made gains among black men and Latino men, especially as well, especially among Latino men, right? And there's another conversation to have perhaps another day about the manosphere and other issues and things that are going on with men that has it drawn them and that they become more attracted to someone like Donald Trump. But that's certainly something that maybe we could talk about in the, when we take some time to actually deal with some questions and answers about that. So when we think about why he won, right, there's what people say happened. But I think that answer is really complicated, right? And I think I tried to complicate it in some ways to explain that. Now, of course, the other question is, why did Kamala Harris lose, right? Now, and that's the big question, right? Now, what was interesting is, of course, the Democratic Party and, and pundits and everybody out there, they were all over the place trying to explain what happened to Harris. And here are some of the things, right? And then some of this you're probably familiar with, right? One explanation was that Harris was too centrist, right? That was one explanation. She wasn't radical enough. She didn't really come out there and push these radical programs and projects and really explain, here's where we're going to take the country in this direction. Others said, well, actually, Harris was too far to the left. She needed to be more centrist. It wasn't that she was too far out, in the center. The problem was she was too far to the left, right? And then there are others who said, well, maybe Harris should have picked Josh Shapiro to be her running mate, right? That was the other sort of criticism of her, right? Then others said, well, Harris actually didn't define herself well enough in how she differed from Joe Biden. Other people said, well, Harris should have run on the strong record of the Biden administration, right? Some people said Harris didn't distance herself enough. Harris spent too much time decrying Trump as a tyrant and not enough time talking about her own policies, right? That was something else people said. Others said Harris didn't spend enough time talking about how Trump is a threat to democracy, right? Some said, well, Biden waited too long to drop out, so Democrats couldn't vet a better candidate than Harris to run and possibly have success. Others said, well, maybe the Democrats should have stayed with Joe Biden, right? And they shouldn't have abandoned him. He beat Trump once, maybe he could beat Trump again. Others said, well, if only Biden hadn't called Trump voters trash, right? Remember that when that happened? Maybe that was the cause. Others said the Democrats abandoned the working class a long time ago and got what they deserved. That was another argument that people made. So when I came out of this election, as you may feel right now, well, what the heck happened, right? How did she lose that race, right? Especially given the fact that in a number of polls, she was actually up. In some of the battleground states, she was either tied or leading, and Donald Trump swept all of the battleground states. I get to the question, but let me just make this last point about this. So I'm going to offer an alternative possibility, right? But this is our second question that I want to explore together with all of you, is why did Kamala Harris lose? Here's a possibility. There was a guy by the name of Tom Bradley who ran for governor of California back in the 1980s. Bradley was the former mayor of Los Angeles. He was incredibly popular. People thought he was going to win, and he was up in the polls going into election day. And then Bradley lost on election day. So what we political scientists ended up concluding about this election is something we call the Bradley effect. And the Bradley effect is this: whites who intended to vote for the white candidate nonetheless told pollsters they were undecided or likely to vote for the non-white candidate, even though they never intended to vote for Tom Bradley. So in other words, what they did was they gave what's called the socially acceptable answer. That way you don't think, for example, I'm racist. I'm willing to vote for the black candidate. But once I actually step into the polling booth, I make a different decision. I've coined a phrase only because I've never heard anybody else say it, but I'll say it: the Clinton effect. Men who intended to vote for the male candidate nonetheless told pollsters they were undecided and likely to vote for the woman candidate. If you remember, Hillary Clinton was predicted to win easily in 2016, right? And then she nonetheless lost, and we were baffled by what happened. I would argue that there were people who said, I'm going to vote for the woman, but when it came to actually voting, they said no. So this is definitely my own phrase here, the Harris effect. And the Harris effect is that whites and non-whites who intended to vote for the white candidate nonetheless told pollsters they were undecided or likely to vote for Harris. So what this meant is that on election day, right, because this race was really close, Trump won by less than 2%. And it didn't take millions of votes in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and some other battleground states to really flip the outcome of that election because of our electoral college. She could have won, and she didn't need millions of votes, but if enough people who had said they were willing to vote for her, but on election day changed their mind because they could not vote for a woman of color and elect her for president, then they basically told pollsters the socially acceptable answer, which is, I'm willing to vote for her, but in reality, they weren't willing to cast that ballot when they had an opportunity to. You want to ask a question, go ahead.
I so appreciate this because I saw it.
One moment, please.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry about that. So I appreciate this argument. I immediately thought, how did she lose? But then I said, she didn't lose, the Democratic Party lost. Do you think there's some truth to that, that it was like the Democrats lost, like they lost? That it was. I didn't see it as Harris losing.
Yeah.
I saw it as the Democrats lost. Could you speak to that?
But overall, it actually wasn't a bad night for the Democratic Party, right? They lost the presidency, but we were expecting a landslide, right? That the Democrats in the Senate, they had more seats up for grabs. I mean, they did lose control, but the Republicans have a very small control of the House and also the Senate. And again, the longer conversation is about those sort of undemocratic aspects of our Constitution, like the Senate, for example. But I will say this, though, that the party has some work to do in order to build the base, because as I said before, for 8.9 million people of color who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and most of them, even though some of them switched over to Donald Trump, most of them nonetheless stepped back. You can't win as a Democrat if you lose that many people of color who are key to your base. The black community itself makes up over a quarter of self-identified Democrats. If black people don't show up at the polls, the Democrats have a big problem winning national elections in that particular sense. Do you have a question?
You have emphasized the gender factor and somewhat note the race factor. And I have a question. Do you think that if Kamala would have been a white woman, will that make a difference?
Yeah. Hillary Clinton is the example of the difficulty. Now, there's a larger discussion, and I really encourage you guys to have that conversation about the ability of a woman to actually win the White House. And I think there are some real challenges in our country right now, where in many other places around the world, they have accepted the idea that women can lead the country, even in places that we would not expect that to have happened in. And in the US, it has been a real challenge, and I think it will probably continue to be a challenge. I mean, when you really think about it, Hillary Clinton was one of the most qualified on paper people we've ever seen run for president. And yet she was attacked and vilified as if, you know, she was unqualified and not someone who can hold the job. And Kamala Harris, former state attorney general, former U.S. senator, vice president, and they called her a DEI hire, right? And said she slept her way to the top and she didn't earn her right to be on the ticket. And J.D. Vance was a couple years in the Senate, and then he's now a heartbeat away from the White House. And his only claim to fame was he wrote a book, right? And that's just, so there's a definite different standard when it comes to women in that sense that I think needs to be figured out. I think right here, yeah.
I don't know am I using this right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that a woman will ever lead the country, like in our future?
I think in the future, yes. I think getting there, how we get there, will be a lot of the work that has to go on in our country to make that happen. I really do. So, So we've got that idea. First two questions, right? Okay, first question, how did Trump win? Second question, why did Kamala Harris win? Third question, is Donald Trump an anomaly, right? I hear that a lot, that Donald Trump is like this weird figure in American history. He is so different from the kind of country we are today, and he just sort of stands out as being somebody that's just really strange and doesn't fit in with what America is about. So let me be blunt. Trump is probably the most overtly white supremacist president we've had since Woodrow Wilson, right? He's overtly. He uses dehumanizing and racist language to describe undocumented immigrants. He describes them as coming from S-hole countries. I'm in the church. Allegedly here to steal our jobs and material possessions. He claims that Haitians eat our cats and dogs. He said that we're only sending rapists and murderers. You are coming to the country. They're coming here to vote Democrat only. They're coming here to replace white people and make them a minority. This is the kind of stuff Donald Trump talks about, and a lot of people around him talk about and say. Now, to be an anomaly would mean you are way out there and most people are not out there with you. I want to challenge that idea. There was a YouGov poll that was done before the election in which what we found is in the poll was that Trump voters were not actually offended by a lot of the stuff he said. In fact, many Trump supporters actually agreed with him. And so, for example, 52% of likely Trump voters believe that the claim Haitians are eating cats and dogs, or pets, is definitely or probably true, and another 24% said they were unsure. So 75+% heard at the presidential debate where he leaned into the camera and said they're eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio. And over 70% of likely Trump voters before the election said it's either definitely true or possibly true, with no evidence and it being rejected by people at the local level in that community. 81% of likely Trump voters believed the claim that Venezuela is deliberately sending people from prisons and mental institutions to the US, and they thought it was definitely or probably true, and another 10% said they were unsure. Again, completely unfounded, and yet many of his supporters actually agreed with it. 64% of Trump voters believe that the claim that crime has fallen around the world but has peaked in the US is definitely or probably true, and another 16% say they are unsure, right? And this is in spite of a mountain of data that shows crime rates are actually down, but it's important to the narrative that's being spun, especially about the kind of people who live in cities, right, and their criminality. 53% of Trump supporters believe that the claim that, quote, in some states it is legal to kill a baby after birth. 53% said it was definitely or probably true, and another 16% said they were unsure if that was true. 28% of likely Trump voters believe that the claim that public schools are providing students with sex change operations is definitely or probably true, with 17% saying they're unsure. And finally, 90% of likely Trump voters believe the claim that Democrats want migrants to come into the country illegally so that they can vote. 90% said that was definitely true, and another 4% said they were unsure. So in many ways, when people talk about Donald Trump as being sort of way out there in this anomaly, this thing that we can't really explain because he's not us. He's not what America is and what America stands for. What I would argue is that he represents a lot of us that are in this country, more so than we probably are comfortable with acknowledging that is in our country. And I think that leads to that question of how do we have these discussions? How do we move forward as a country given that sort of reality in that sense, right? So where do we go from here? I wrote something very recently that actually I published, and I want to just sort of read that and sort of thinking about some of the attacks on DEI and what has really bothered me about the outcome of the election. I'll sort of conclude on this and then enter into a discussion. And that is the last question, is where do we go from here? To talk with you guys about. So next year, the nation will celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, right? And that's the founding document of the United States. I'm arguing that the American Republic was founded based on an ideal that did not apply to everyone. The white man who drafted the Declaration did not intend for the words in the preamble to apply to women, indigenous people, or African Americans. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was never meant for everyone. The Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s forced America to hold up a mirror to itself, one with the words of the preamble of the Declaration inscribed in translucent letters. Prior to the 1960s, if you were Native American, African American, Latino, LGBTQ, you struggled to see yourself in that mirror. However, when most white Americans, especially white men, held up that mirror, the only face they recognized was their own. Regardless of their social status, they firmly believed that the founders had intended America to be a country only for white people. The activists who protested during the 1960s were determined to make the country live up to its founding creed, to bring into existence an inclusive society. Inspired by the Declaration's assumption of the equality of all people with rights impossible to be taken away or given up, they demanded that America become a country for everyone. The fight for equality during the 1960s led to landmark legislation, including the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Combined, these pieces of legislation intended to guarantee equal employment opportunity, end discrimination in public accommodations and housing on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin, and ban literacy tests and poll taxes and other things that allowed states to adopt laws to suppress voter turnout. An inclusive society is one that sets as a goal the respectful, equitable, and full participation of every individual. An inclusive society is one in which every individual is not simply tolerated, but is valued regardless of how different they are. In an inclusive society, diversity enriches the social fabric by expanding and ensuring access to opportunities in all aspects of life for everyone, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, or their physical or mental impairment. Since returning to the White House, Donald Trump is working with a kind of laser-like focus on fulfilling a campaign promise he made to his mostly white MAGA supporters to take America back. His goal is to dismantle the achievements of the 1960s, to take America back to the late 18th century, when most believed the new nation was being born would be a country only for white people. Since his return, Trump has signed multiple executive orders with the goal of ending diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and programs in government and the private sector. He and other members of the administration obsessively attack DEI, even when it has no clear connection to the topic being discussed, such as when Trump inexplicably talked about the collision between a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter and an American Airlines regional jet and claimed it was a DEI issue. At his first public address to the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said, quote, "I think the single dumbest phrase in military history is, our diversity is our strength." Despite the transparency of Trump's grievance-fueled white identity politics, the mainstream media and leaders of the Democratic Party are sticking to their initial explanation for his return to the White House, one based largely on the idea that his supporters blame the Democratic Party for the economic upheaval caused by post-pandemic inflation and the long-range effects of deindustrialization and globalization. But the economic situation in America does not fully explain the outcome of the 2024 election or his popularity with the majority of white Americans. In 2008, the U.S. Census Bureau projected that by 2042, the United States would be a majority-minority country. The press and Democrats continue to understate the magnitude of the racial anxiety and anger generated by the possibility that the white majority would disappear in America. The sense of loss and decline that whites are being replaced, and this is language that they use. They talk about being replaced, right? So this sense of loss and decline that whites are being replaced is palpable to many. The belief is that people of color can become the majority only at the expense of the white population. The racial and social hierarchies that have characterized America since its founding gave many whites a sense of purpose and meaning. Now it feels like that birthright has been stolen. And MAGA's response, loud and clear, is take America back, as if it's been taken by someone, right? Trump's attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion are the centerpiece of his agenda. He returns to that idea over and over, constantly, right? When was the last time you heard him talk about reducing the price of eggs or gas or rent? Nowhere near as much as he talks about DEI. Attacking Harvard, attacking Yale, attacking Columbia, right? Attacking other institutions in our society. And the centerpiece of that attack is DEI. So there is a clear obsession with that idea and what it means and how dismantling that and what it will accomplish. Trump promised his supporters that he would be their retribution. Again, these are words he used. And I think that erasing the social and racial progress of the last 60 years appears to be one of his top priorities. A promise that I think over the next 3.5 or more years, he plans to keep. We're at the front end, not the tail end. We're at the front end of a radical assault on the last 60 years of social and racial progress in American society. And I'll end on that high note. So thanks a lot. Any questions or comments about those questions? Oh, you got a hand in the back. And also feel free to talk. Don't necessarily feel like you got to ask me the question, but also provide the comment. Go ahead.
What Professor asked earlier about the loss from Kamala Harris, was it because her being a Democrat? Also, I heard I was surprised of, like you said, a lot of brown men, Hispanics, and black men who were voting for Trump. And I'd get in this debate and I'd go, why? Why would you want to do that? They said, because he's a businessman and he's going to make us money. They said he's also a rich man when he's not bankrupt. So, I mean, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Also, I really feel there were so many men that were not going to have a woman president, especially one like Kamala, who was multiracial. I think, and I heard too, a lot of people thought, well, she's claiming black, but I really don't see it. I think there was some confusion about her diversity and her racial, ethnicity, and she just had a lot against her. There was no way she was going to win.
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be a female president anytime soon?
I absolutely think it's going to happen. The question of when is, I really can't say for sure. I mean, that's the thing. Go ahead.
May I answer that question?
Go right ahead.
You know, I think the most likely way we will get a woman president, I think it's going to be a steeper climb for a woman of color than it would be for a white woman, but I think it's going to be a steep climb for any woman. Last fall, I looked at the poll data and the number of people that said it's still hovering around 5% of the people who will tell you that they won't vote for a woman. So that's before we get to the people that kind of keep it to themselves and give the socially desirable answer. I think the way we're most likely, and this is not original with me, to get a female president is if a male president dies and there's a female vice president.
And that opened the door.
I agree with that, and I have this fantasy. I don't know if I should say this because it's live stream, but there's a particular female in the politics scene that is the spouse of a former president that I believe that if she would have getting on that ballot, it would have shifted the narrative. It would have gotten people out of their projects, out of their buildings, and voting. Maybe. Maybe it will have brought a different population that is not caring about representing and exercising their right to vote. That will have impacted numbers. I still think that could happen. Women in all sectors experience the challenge of sexism when we are in positions of leadership. And this is a long battle, and this is not going to end anytime soon.
Just to indicate is that Dean Howe is the only Latina dean head of an Episcopal cathedral, period. So she knows what she's talking about. Other questions?
Yes, I have one of my questions is, do you think DEI, yes, the attempt to revert, but do you sense a sense of revolt in the air? Because I feel there is a pushback. We're just, because of the mistreatment and the civil rights attack upon those of being deported, the deported situation is causing a fear to speak up and to revolt and to resist. But I still feel as if the undercurrent is becoming a climate where we're not going back. So, and I'll say that live. I'm military, I'm a veteran, female, I did vote for Kamala. But if I agreed with her, I did not agree with her campaign of, and I'll be frank, blackness. I did not agree with that because I didn't feel like that represented who she really was. And that was my only objection to her, and that was just my personal opinion, but it didn't negate me from voting and seeing her ability to lead us. And she had a platform, and all of the things that they say she didn't have, she actually did, but they were unwilling because, like you said, you pointed out the fact that it is the white male agenda that is being pushed, but how do you overcome that fear of this, and the fact that everything that Donald Trump has stated as being the plight of immigrants is actually the European, in English, origin of emptying their jails upon American soil. So that's what, where's the camera? That's what the public is not understanding. This isn't something that is new. This is the agenda of England that is now being played upon America, which is supposed to be the land of the free, the brave, the just, the equal opportunities. So I hope that us today, as these series take place, that we will rally together, that we will find our place to resist, wherever that is within our community. So I appreciate what you're doing today in the series in totality, and it's helping me as not a new transplant, but it's helping me connect to find my place here in this community, because I do believe Hartford and Connecticut is a political position, and I do believe we can influence and spread things because people are watching. This is the blue state, and even though it's small, it's got a lot of economic wealth here, and that speaks volume. So thank you.
Your comments. I was playing with my mic because I think some of the feedback I'm creating. But, certainly I think there's a lot in terms of what you're asking in the question. I think the dissent is growing in the country, and I think more and more people are starting to sort of get their feet under it because it came as an avalanche. I mean, when you think about, I was joking with someone today, it's like 80-some days, but it feels like 8 years, right? I mean, it has been a lot in these 80-some days that we've been hit with, and the changes that they are pushing at the federal level are huge, right? When I talk to my students, I teach a course on urban politics, and I was talking to them just the other day about the potential effects on education and educational spending. Some of my students want to be teachers one day, and they're really thinking about what does this mean for public education in this country, for example, to see, programs like Head Start and other things. And I'm a pre-K kid, who grew up, and I'm also someone who would not have been able to go to college without having the opportunity to have a Pell Grant. I should go out to the grave of Senator Pell every night and every year and just thank him for pushing that legislation, because at the end of the day, all of those things I think are being jeopardized. So when people are out marching and saying hands off, I think that will sort of grow in momentum. I think Connecticut, you're right, is a small state, but some of the most active people who have been stepping up to the plate, people like Chris Murphy, Richard Blumenthal, Secretary Tong. I mean, it's a long list of folks at the national and also at the state level here in Connecticut who have stood up and are fighting for Connecticut's values. And you're absolutely right that it's also upon the public to figure this out. I mean, the harder question for me, and I think you guys can really explore as you do these conversations, is that at the same time, we share the state with a lot of people who don't have our views and values on many things. And so we still have to share this planet, right? And we've got some critical issues like climate change and other things that are now being threatened, because of some of the actions of this administration. And we've got to be able to make that case. But I think for me, in terms of the presentation, we need to make that case very clear-eyed about what exactly it is that we're dealing with and the kind of work that needs to be done, and how that may not be easy to do, but it's absolutely necessary work that has to be done in that sense. Okay.
And it's just my thought process. Thank you all for allowing me to share. But I was thinking the conversation, because of the support for the Trump administration, is one of economic focus, as well as unfortunately, the demise of minority, I won't say causes, but things that are deemed as being only accessed by minority, which once again is true, being SNAP, EBT, public assistance programs. The majority are white, and my field is social work. So these are the numbers, and that's fact, but based on facts. So do you think that as Democrats really and truly take their head out of the sand and get to work on economic advancements for people? Because I feel like we have it in our wheelhouse, but we're so worried about the opposition, we're not dealing with the situations. And it still hasn't been equitable. It's been just enough to keep people quiet instead of really doing the work, because America is great. And we all have the abilities to make our communities the best. I don't care if you're the janitor. We saw it in COVID that the janitorial position and public works became so very important.
That person at the grocery store was more important than I was during the summer.
So it's
more important to me.
It's addressing that once again, equality,
Yeah.
but the economic and with teachers, I substitute teach, and I'm like, I know that that's not my gift, but for those that want to go into teaching, making it a livable income, regardless of its private or public opportunities for students, the teacher is one of the most invaluable assets of this country, really and truly.
And as a university professor, I absolutely agree with you. We are invaluable.
We really are. We really are.
But you know what I will say to you is this. I think also what's important is that we not in this moment, and I think whether it's the next 4 years or going forth in the country, that what's also really important is the work we do at the community level. I mean, it's great to sort of have great leaders who will do the right thing and provide leadership in Washington or, you know, down the street at City Hall. But the reality is people in neighborhoods, people in, you know, faith institutions. I mean, there are so many of us who need to be engaged, who need to be doing that sort of hard work at that grassroots level. And I think ultimately that's what helps us survive the next 3.5 years, but it also will be what will be needed to try to heal the country, right? Because what we are going through now, what we've been going through the last decade or so, and I would argue even going back to the Obama years, it was some crazy stuff during his presidency that really, went to another level. We've got a lot of work to do, assuming this all stops in 3.5 years. But part of the challenge, as a poll just came out the other day that said 71% of Republicans say they're MAGA, whatever that means, right? And so that means there's a lot of work we've got to do with our neighbors, for many people, it's their father, their sister, their brother, their kids, so there's a lot of work that has to be done, and that leadership can't be the senators, it can't be the Congress people, it has to be ordinary people, it has to be people in the community who are doing that work. And in the absence of that, the kind of healing I think we're going to need to do as a country, it won't happen in the absence of that, because we're in really troubled times. We're finding it very hard to even talk to people. I talk to my students sometimes and they'll come in and they'll talk about just how difficult it is for relatives now to get together on Thanksgiving and Christmas, because some are MAGA, some are not, and they are not meeting anywhere in the middle. And that's kind of hard right there. And that's going to take some time, I think, to really heal.
When Donald Trump ran for president the first time, and then when he won here recently, 2024, were there more brown people voting for him in 2020 or less? I'm curious.
Actually, look at the numbers, the trend. Republicans have been making some gains among males of color for a while, right?
Your rappers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Black women are a solid block for the Democrats. They come through, and they vote more than black men do. And again, that's why I say the larger conversation, and this, faith communities are a great place, I think, to have this conversation, is what's going on with men, especially young men right now. And especially the manosphere and the stuff that they are encountering on social media, the kind of information, the way they feel about their sort of status in society, how society is moving. And progressing around them, especially in a country that has historically been a patriarchal society. Trying to figure this out going forward, I think, is going to be really important to do. I think I read a number like 60% of people who are undergrads are women right now. You go to some historically black colleges and universities, I think the number's around 26% male. In fact, there are more non-black students at historically black colleges and universities than black men. So as women sort of become better educated, get in positions of sort of leadership in society, we're going to have to deal with these tensions that are going to emerge around, sort of income issues and earning potential. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, and then there's just some toxic stuff that's being spewed. And I think if you listen, and I have the misfortune of actually paying too close attention to politics and what people say and reading too much, it's some scary stuff that's circulating, and some of those folks have the ear of the president, and he said things that really reflect some of those sort of values of returning men to their rightful place as the head of the household, and women being subservient. And that is not a way out there sort of, weird people on the far extreme. That's really been centered in our politics, and I think that's something we've got to really contend with. I think you're going to say something. Did you want the mic? Yeah.
In my experience, there's a number of African-American men who are listed as independent. And that skews some of the numbers in terms of how they vote. And that has a lot to do, in my perception, with what you say in terms of how they see themselves in society, trying not to be defined and stay where they choose to be. Does that make sense?
There are lots of issues around identity that a lot of people are having right now. And I just think that there's some work to be done, in our country, and to address those issues in ways that ultimately build an attitude of inclusivity as opposed to an attitude of hyper-masculinity. I mean, we got a lot to figure out, I think, on that front. A lot to figure out. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative of asking the last question, and then we can continue the conversation if Dr. Sukkau is willing. And I know we've had a number of conversations sort of in passing about the future of voting rights. And if we're talking about, what's going to happen in a year and a half or in 3 years' time, that's going to be central. So what do you see as the future of voting rights in this country?
I think in many ways it's going to be bifurcated, right? We're going to see stuff pushed at the national level, red states. They're going to be a lot different than things that happen in a blue state like Connecticut. The national level, they're pushing for things like requiring photo ID, right, or proof of citizenship. Connecticut's going to fight against that kind of requirement. But I imagine a state like Mississippi or Alabama or North Carolina may actually embrace that. And so we're in this situation now where, and I think this is going to be on a range of many other issues. But what's also interesting is the public is really surprising with regard to how it may push back, right? I believe it was Missouri for years rejected expansion of Medicaid, and it's a red state, and Missouri voters said, no, we want Medicaid expansion, right? We want an opportunity, because there are a lot, and I think this is your point earlier, there are a lot of poor whites and poor blacks and poor Latinos, for example, who benefit tremendously from these programs. So there's an opportunity for people to work together. So when it comes to voting rights, I think we've got, with this next year, with the midterm elections, I think we're going to have some real challenges in different places, around that. What will be interesting is that when you think about and you connect to some of the things that's happened with some of the big law firms that were liberal law firms, those are the ones, I was talking to a friend of mine who works with the ACLU who explained to me, those are the people they turn to because when these legal challenges they have to do come up around voting rights, they turn to these firms and they say, hey, we can't do this by ourselves, we need this extra help. Now those firms are being attacked by the Trump administration and have been basically pushed into a corner where they may not pick up the phone when people call. And so when you're trying to challenge things that are occurring in different states, the kind of the lawyers you need and the legal support may no longer be there. Plus, you're likely to see in many states a range of different sort of range of different pieces of legislation that are about to be pushed that will be designed to suppress voting rights. So the answer to the question, the long sort of answer to the question is that I think it will be very uneven. Some states will continue to protect rights. Other states, you are likely to see suppression and other efforts made to disenfranchise people. And the Justice Department will not be an ally to people who are fighting against. So we may be headed through, some really troubling years over the next few years going forward.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Bilal Sukkoo for his enlightening, well thought out, well researched, thoughtful lecture and charge to action in our local communities. And thank Christchurch Cathedral and CT State Capitol for sponsoring this series. And we have one more session left in this round, and next week, Dr. Kadian Reed from University of St. Joseph will be here to talk about health inequities. So please join us again if you're free. Thank you so much, Dr. Sukkoo.
Before choir rehearsal, yes, but now I have to go.